Alrighty, TikTokers. Another Q&A. Lots of awesome questions here. I think I've got about 85. So, yeah, there's a bunch here. I might actually break out into their own kind of little episodes. And there's a few questions, obviously, that I don't know too much about. So, as I said, I don't do any research for these Q&As. You're just going to get my first take on everything. So, yeah, that's it. Let's get into it. So the first few are from Julian. Julian, how am I doing, man? I'm doing good, thanks. It's nice of you to ask. I haven't surfed in basically 2 months. Surf's been terrible, so I've been an unhappy boy. But yeah, I'm all good, man. Thank you. So, what would I change in the most recent white paper update? I'd probably look more seriously at ballistic missile defense, although, of course, this all comes with the caveat that money doesn't grow on trees. But yeah, BMD is probably something we really need to look at. Is one of the few vulnerabilities, a huge, given our geography, we have such strategic depth that it's really these long-range systems that pose the greatest threat to Australia. So I think ballistic missile defense really should be something we look at, pretty seriously. I didn't see a lot of that in the strategic paper update, the white paper update. Another thing I think we maybe should at least start doing feasibility studies on is maybe expanding the RAAF. We've had the same number of combat squadrons basically for 50 years now. And yes, we keep getting better and better platforms, but maybe we need more platforms. So I think maybe we should look at maybe keeping the Super Hornets until the end of their useful lives, maybe in 2040 or so. And raising a new squadron of F-35s. We should at least look at how feasible that is. It may not be affordable, but it's something we should look at, I think. It seems strange given how different our strategic circumstance is now from what it was 30 years ago, that we have basically the same force structure in the RAAF or something very similar. So yeah, maybe an expansion of the RAAF is in order. So next question, did Malcolm fuck up the future submarine program? A little bit. So did Gillard, to be fair. From my memory, the Gillard government really, they didn't make a decision quickly enough, to be honest. And it kind of pushed the whole thing back a good 3 or 4 years. And this is the whole issue with the attack class. Like, we're going to get 12 boats, and that's amazing. That's, that puts us right up there with some of the biggest navies in the world in terms of their submarine program. But this isn't until like 2050 or something. We need to be getting these boats rolling off production lines like right now. And it just took way too long for critical decisions to be made. So I'd actually say Gillard had a lot to do with that. In terms of the choice of the submarine, whether we should have gone with Soryu. Look, Soryu would have been a much less risky option. It would have provided us with a very capable submarine very quickly, but I don't think it really fundamentally met the needs of the ADF. Realistically, what Australia needs in a submarine is a nuclear boat. That's what Australia's strategic demands require. And but for our own kind of weirdness, our domestic weirdness with both nuclear energy and our lack of a nuclear energy infrastructure, we can't refuel nuclear boats here, even if it was politically acceptable to build nuclear boats. So, and that's a core requirement, is that we be able to do all deep maintenance in Australia for such a critical capability. And I think that's a very fair thing to want. But what that means is we have to basically build our own boats, our own kind of boats, because normal diesel electric boats just don't really fit our capabilities. So we have to take what is a French nuclear boat, the Barracuda, and change its power plant to meet our requirements. So I don't think necessarily the selection of the French boat was a fuck up. We'll see how bad the program goes. If it goes at all reasonably well, I think it'll prove to be the right choice. There will be cost overruns with attack, definitely. Like, it will be more expensive than people already think, and it's already super expensive. We should expect that. These are very advanced programs, really cutting edge technologically. However, we can't have huge program delays. If we do, things will just really get out of control from a time frame perspective. The Collins class boats are getting old, and really we need replacements soon. So yeah, I just hope there's no more delays. So, do suicide drones deserve the hype? Yes and no. I think we can look at conflicts in places like Azerbaijan and take take lessons that may not really apply to more advanced militaries. You got to remember, the thing about these drones is they're reasonably cost effective, and we're not talking about top tier militaries here. So, for example, they're not operating in a very severe ECM environment, electronic warfare environment. I wonder how they would go if there was, for example, a growler overhead, really interrupting a lot of their comms. Also, there's ready-made countermeasures in terms of just anti-missile and anti-mortar and shell systems, such as CRAM, the land-based closed-in weapon system. That would literally murder even a swarm of incoming drones. It's literally designed to shoot down a swarm of incoming supersonic anti-ship missiles. So, against top-tier militaries, it mightn't be as effective as we, or I kind of think by looking at what's happening in, kind of minor conflicts. So, look, they're definitely an advancement in warfare and something that has changed the game a bit. But, I would refrain from thinking that the whole world's changed just from what we've seen in the last few months. So how concerning are the events surrounding Taiwan? I think this is pretty normal, man. So every time that the US makes an arms sale to Taiwan, the Chinese get all upset about it. I mean, they've been doing this for 20 years. I think it's more concerning at the moment because of the general tension between the United States and China, or between China and US allies in the region. The US faces this issue where they don't want to antagonize China too much. The US prestige and US credibility are literally tied up in the defense of Taiwan. If the US were to fail when push came to shove, if push did come to shove, I really think the US position in Asia would crumble, and a lot of Asian nations would really start coming to terms with the Chinese. So the Americans want to bolster Taiwan's ability to defend itself without antagonizing the PRC too much. You will see these kinds of weapons sales from time to time. Every single time the Chinese make a fair bit of noise. So can the US blockade China in the event of a conflict? Yes. Yeah, I believe so. China has some severe geographical problems to deal with. Most of its trade comes through the Malacca Strait, and there's no easy alternative. They don't have they don't have a western seaboard to just route things around. So everything comes through the South and East China Seas. So this is a huge issue for them. And, you don't have to blockade China by sitting warships off their ports, in the traditional way that, say, the UK did to Napoleon's France. You can just use maritime choke points. This is called the FAR blockade. So you can actually blockade China several hundreds or thousands of miles away from its ports. And this is very difficult for the Chinese to counter because they need to project sufficient force to break the blockade that far away from their own bases. So, you could actually see large-scale naval and air battles happening, for example, just north of Indonesia in some kind of conflict. That's why you can imagine Australia would be actually very critical in a war with China by allowing the Allies to stage large-scale air power from northern Australia would really, allow them to dominate the Malacca Strait. So, they definitely could. Now, would this force capitulation? Who knows, man? It's so hard to predict, large-scale conflicts like that. You would think that, look, the major issue with China is regime stability. So, if regime stability was threatened, the Chinese Communist Party would probably do whatever it could to end the conflict. But you never know, it might actually strengthen regime stability having an external conflict with the United States. It just depends. If they lost a war badly to the US, it basically could, they could spell the end of Xi's regime specifically. Whether the Communist Party itself would fall, who knows? But that's definitely potentially a way to bring about an end to the conflict. But you can never predict those kinds of things. So next question, is the ADF too precious with their project requirements? Sometimes, yeah, but we've really seen a shift towards more mature platforms over the last kind of 10 years. I think we've been stung by a couple of programs that really looked great on paper, but were an absolute pain in the ass to utilize. I think the thing about the ADF is we rely on a technological advantage to offset larger opponents. So the Australian defence industry is always looking for cutting edge solutions. However, often just military off the shelf will work just fine, and it's not worth the trouble. So I think it depends on the kind of project you're talking about. So I think for something like the submarine program, it's worth going for the best we can, because it's such a cornerstone of Australia's future defence capability. It's one of the most important things we have. So I think it's worth going big there. But for things like, for example, the arms reconnaissance helicopter, we got sold on Tiger. It looked really great, had huge long range. We're like, wow, this is going to be great. And when reality is we should have just bought Apaches that were off the shelf. There was already a huge pool of users to share developmental costs. It was mature, much better choice. We saw the same thing with the MH-60R Romeo Seahawk. Basically, we had a bunch of Sea Sprites, which were older airframes, and we had this amazing idea that we were going to basically upgrade them ourselves and get this really amazing capability in this small helicopter that was going to be great. And it was an absolute nightmare. And we should have just bought Seahawks, totally in common with the US Navy. And we have now, and it's really increased Australia's anti-submarine warfare capability, having the Romeo Seahawks. Same thing with Super Hornet. Instead of going through a really crazy tender process, we just bought a reasonably mature platform, had a full weapons integration, had a high level of commonality with another large pool of users, which was the United States Navy. Problem solved. Really good buy. So sometimes I think we are too precious, and sometimes I think military off-the-shelf options should be considered a little more often. But yeah, like I said, if we're going to maintain a technological advantage, sometimes we need to go for cutting-edge stuff. And so I think it was right to go with the F-35, even though it was a risky program. And it remains to be seen what will happen with the attack class. But if they're delivered reasonably on time and reasonably on budget, I think that will be a better choice as well, to go big and go for the more capable option. So overview of the modern RAAF. I might break that one out into its own little post. Like I might do a little episode on that. Because it probably deserves more than just me sitting here talking about it. So I might do like a 20-minute video on that. Maybe the whole to ADF in general. So I might skip that one. Alrighty, Mason. If I was in charge of the Wehrmacht in 1940, what would I do to capitalize on the fall of France? And what was my 10-year goal for that war? So am I in charge of the Wehrmacht, or am I in charge of Nazi Germany? If I am basically teleported into Hitler's body, I would really... Firstly, I would not go to war with the Soviet Union. Absolutely. There was no need to go to war with the Soviet Union. And the reality was, in 1940, after the fall of France, the Soviets and the Germans had a pretty good relationship. I'm sure there was planning on both sides for contingency of going to war, but there was no way Stalin wanted a war with Germany at the time. The Soviet Union was extremely weak. So there was a large-scale flow of raw materials coming from the Soviet Union to Germany, and manufactured goods and expertise going the other way. So they had quite a good trade relationship. They had something, almost of a strategic partnership. They had a non-aggression pact in force. They also had, negotiations to actually bring the Soviet Union into the Axis alliance. Now, whether that would have ever brought the Soviet Union into war with the Western Allies is another thing. Because remember, the Italians and the Germans were allies. But the Italians didn't come into the war straight away. So you definitely could have had like a neutral Soviet Union that was pro-Axis. So I would have worked very hard to bring that into fruition. I think basically the decision to go to war with the Soviet Union when the entire British Empire and potentially the United States was still out there was a bad choice, very bad choice. So I would try and focus on developing that relationship as much as possible, and start focusing on submarine production more than they were. I think this was half the issue, though. One of the reasons I think Hitler justified the invasion of the Soviet Union is just to cover the Soviets. The Wehrmacht had to maintain a standing army of over 100 divisions, and it was very hard to switch industrial production from, tanks and infantry equipment and stuff to support the army to, large-scale submarine production. Eventually, they had up to 300 submarines. They probably would have needed more, and more of the research and development effort needed to be, directed towards submarine warfare. So I really think the best way to bring about a peace deal with Great Britain and her empire is to win the Battle of the Atlantic. If Germany can put enough economic pressure on the UK, especially with hanging, dangling a peace deal there the whole time, then maybe, London can be not forced to capitulate, not forced to surrender, but forced to sign a compromise peace, which leaves Germany as the dominant land power in Europe. So that would be my ultimate goal. So not to invade the UK, not to do anything like that, but just to come to a compromise peace. Ironically, I think the whole ideological element of World War II made that less likely than it would have, say, in World War One. It depends. Like, am I a Nazi or am I just like me in charge? Because if Germany's just a normal power and it's not a Nazi power in World War II, then peace with the United Kingdom becomes much more likely. It's just a typical national struggle, just like the Franco-Prussian War or World War One. It's not, this struggle against an evil ideology full of anti-Semitism and all the disgusting stuff the Nazis were. So, yeah, it depends on those things. But I think that would be my ultimate goal, is to try and not invade the Soviet Union and try and bring the United Kingdom to a compromise peace by putting economic pressure on them, which is kind of what the Germans tried to do, but they made some bad decisions along the way. So, hopefully that answers your question. So, Pool's Finest asks, something along the Cairnshook. So, should we do a Cairnshook thing? UK, US, Canada, New Zealand all have small militaries, but provide some of the best soldiers in the world. Should they increase their training together? Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been a difference, especially between, say, Canada and if you count Australia and New Zealand as one block, like we're actually, allied and very closely aligned. You have the Australia-New Zealand block and the Canadian block, Canada. They kind of have different strategic focuses. I mean, obviously, they're very friendly countries, very similar, same heritage, very high, regard for each other. Especially if you look at popular opinion of each of those countries, they're all very popular countries. However, I feel like Canada's focus is primarily on NATO and European security, and Australia/New Zealand's focus is primarily on Asian security. So we haven't had that much opportunity to really work together. Now, the UK is kind of the difference here. The UK has interest in both places, obviously much more so in Europe, but we are certainly seeing the UK have more of a presence in Asia. They're talking about deploying one of the either Queen Elizabeth or the Prince of Wales, I can't remember, carrier strike group to the South China Sea and to Australia, I believe. So there's lots of opportunities between the UK and Australia to improve training. I would say not just so much in their military, in their armies, so not just their troops, but more in their navies. All of these are maritime powers, and we're about to face a maritime conflict with, China. So, not confrontation, I should say, not conflict. So, yeah, I personally would love to see, Royal Canadian Navy, warships visiting Australia and exercising with Australia in Australian waters. I'd love to see, British carrier strike groups in the South China Sea with Australian vessels embedded. I think that's definitely a good possibility. Look, the West and the liberal democracies, we're facing a substantial challenge over the next 30 to 40 years, comparable to the challenge we faced with the Soviet Union. And I think closer integration between countries that really they not just have the same heritage, but they really share the same values, the same outlook on the world. I think that's definitely something we need to look at. I'm all for it, basically. So, Football's Top 10. Is Gladiator a realistic portrayal of ancient Rome? Kind of. It gives a pretty good feel when you're actually, in the city, the big bustling city and the beautiful big Colosseum and the different merchants. The Gladiator slave trader guy was probably, there's probably lots of guys like that. The feeling of the crowd when they're watching the fights and how into it they got, and how much it was like a real sport. I think all of that was pretty accurate. I think it definitely, if you watch the film, it does feel like you're there, I think. It catches the buzz of the city. And, because Rome was the center of the world back then. It was, it was the most amazing city to live in, probably, in the whole world, or at least in the Mediterranean world. And, you really do capture a feeling of that excitement and that buzz. As for the war scene, the battle scenes, the first bits are kind of accurate. The actual fighting that takes place when they're fighting the Germans is kind of crap. But basically all fighting scenes in movies are kind of crap. They all turn into these individual little jewels. But in terms of life in Rome and the city, yeah, it's probably pretty good. Georges asks, what do I believe is the truth about the lost city of Atlantis? I have no idea, man. I've never even looked into it. I would say that it's probably just a myth. Basically, look, maybe it's inspired by some small true tale. But yeah, these kinds of things generally are mythological. But look, I haven't looked that deeply into it. So yeah, that's just my first take. So Tobrocrat asks, what's my favorite chess opening? So at the moment with white, I play either d4, so the Queen's Pawn openings. Generally, I go into a Queen's Gambit. I find that's pretty solid. I don't mind a London system either, which ends up having basically a triangle of pawns behind the Queen's Pawn. I find these quite solid, dependable openings. I don't get into too much trouble. So yeah, I've been playing a lot of d4 of late. I still play the English, which is c4 with white from time to time, just to mix it up. I used to play that quite a lot. I try and get a botfinic system if I can, which is again another really solid opening. So yeah, I guess I like openings that don't get me into too much trouble, even though they don't give me massive attacking chances in the middle game. For black, against e4, so the King's Pawn opening, I've been playing the Caro-Kann actually, which is a c7 d6. Oh, sorry, c6 d5. So yeah, again, I find this a pretty solid opening. I was playing the Sicilian a fair bit, but it's just really sharp. You can get in a lot of trouble if you don't know your moves that well. And yeah, I guess I like openings that keep me safe and get me to a middle game where I can just have it, pretty good even chances, and I'm not, frantically trying to defend myself. Against d4, I either play the Slav, so that's like a response to the Queen's Gambit, or I'll play. I've been playing a Nimzo Indian / Queen's Indian defense as well, which I found works pretty well. I get some pretty good positions from that. You can play that against the English as well. So yeah, hopefully non-chess people won't know what the hell I was just talking about, but yeah, they're my favourite openings at the moment. So Bender Wason asks, why does every video start with so? So I think it's because it was a tick to start off with. I didn't realise I was doing it until I started watching it, and then when I realised I was doing it, I thought I'd just keep doing it because it was funny, and it's like a little signature. So yeah, now it just is. Every video starts with so, and that will continue. Zena says, I love your contact. Thanks for being you. No worries, man. Thank you for being here and participating. It's awesome. Joe Exotic, bro, loved your TV show. Why did the United States end up with more people with native and or why didn't the United States end up with more people with native and Anglo ancestry like in South America? I have no idea. It wouldn't surprise me if basically it was to do with lack of integration between the two societies. Maybe in Southern America things were more urbanized prior to colonization. Maybe in North America losses to disease might have been worse, but I have no idea whether that's true or not. It probably has something to do with the lack of integration between native and colonized societies. So yeah, as opposed to kind of there being a hybrid of the two, which may have been what happens more in South America more often. In North America, Native Americans were basically just pushed off the land and a new European society was built, which is basically what happened in Australia as well. There's not that many people with Native Australian heritage, considering how large the population is. So yeah, probably something to do with that. But again, this is take this with a pinch of salt. This is not something I've really looked into. So this is just my kind of thoughts. So Enchanted Seek asks, why did the Soviets perform so poorly in the Winter War against Finland? So I think two reasons. Firstly was the Officer Purges. So basically because Stalin was an insecure, paranoid bastard, he'd purged the officer corps of the Red Army to a ridiculous degree. I think, down to like, just going from memory, I think 3/4 of divisional commanders, so commanders of divisions, were executed or sent to the bloody gulags. So basically, the very top echelon of Soviet high command, the real generals, the guys who would be commanding armies and corps and fronts, they were gone. And you had guys that, were pretty young and pretty inexperienced in charge of large formations. And the impact this had on the efficiency of the Red Army was devastating. It was really, I don't think Stalin appreciated how much he had hamstrung his own military by doing this. And it was total paranoia as well. A lot of those guys who ended up getting sent to Gulag were pulled back out during, World War II and performed admirably. Some of them were the best generals that, the Soviet Union had. It was just total paranoia and idiocy from Stalin. But I think that was the first reason why. It was just how badly led the whole Red Army was during that conflict. The second was the Finns. So the Finns performed amazingly. You have to give it to the Finns as well. You can't just say the Soviets were terrible. The Finns had a good defensive plan. They maximized geography. So, they had a good defensive line in Karelia or whatever it is, it's basically anchored between a set of lakes and the ocean, the Baltic Sea, and they'd done the best they could with the limited munitions they had to make that an absolute killing field. And it was. The Soviets couldn't penetrate it. And then to the north, in the large wilderness areas that kind of stretch up to the Arctic Ocean, basically the Finns used very mobile small units like battalions that would literally use skis and that kind of thing. And instead of trying to hold a front, they fought this very inspired mobile battle where they would get in between the different Soviet columns, which would be stuck to the roads, and they would get behind them, and there'd be lots of ambush and confusion. And again, because of how dysfunctional the Red Army was, this just basically paralyzed them, and they suffered terrible losses, I should say, not total. So, two things. I think the Officer Purges are the first thing to understand about that conflict, and just how good the Finns were. Hopefully that answers your question. Little Johnny would love to hear about modern-day military capabilities and possible additions, also involvement in Vietnam. Do you know what I might do? I might actually do an actual post on YouTube about the history of the ADF, the modern history of the ADF, and I'll go over all its capabilities and kind of how we got to where we are and where we're looking. So it's probably better that I do that in an actual post than an actual video rather than just here. Also, Australia's involvement in Vietnam. That could be another interesting one I might do. I might do an actual episode on that. So, Sustin, thanks, man. Just saying, really appreciate your channel. Thank you, dude. I appreciate you too. So, Ben Israel Shapiro. Why are there statues of Hannibal all over Rome when he was Rome's greatest enemy for so long? So, I don't know. I'm sure there were statues of Hannibal. I'm not sure they were everywhere. It's certainly not something I've run into in all of my studies. But often there were statues of great people like this. So there's this anecdote of, I think it was in Plutarch, where Caesar was a young man, in his 20s, I think, and he was deployed to Spain in a administrative role. And he saw a statue of Alexander the Great, and he broke down crying because, Alexander had conquered the world by the time he was 30, and Caesar had achieved nothing. Now, this story is probably, not real. But the interesting thing it shows is there were statues of these guys all over the Mediterranean world. Now, the thing about Rome and Hannibal, I think the Romans called the Second Punic War often the Hannibalic War. For them, it was all about Hannibal. Hannibal was their single greatest boogeyman. The defeats at places like Cannae would be scored into the Roman psyche for generations. And, I think, although he was their greatest enemy, they also greatly admired how capable the guy was. And so by putting statues of him around, it reminded them of how great their achievement was. They defeated this epic general, this great man, through their perseverance and through their force of arms. They defeated Hannibal. So I think that might have something to do with it, mainly. Firstly, because he was such a great person historically, and secondly, is an implicit reminder of Rome's greatness, that they had overcome such a man as this. So I don't think these statues came from the time of the Second Punic War. We're probably talking about the early empire there. So they're looking 200 years in the past. It's probably a little bit how Napoleon might be remembered to British people now. But I think that might be the reason why. Alrighty, so user 3BSE5, blah, 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 blah. Who do I think the best commander, except Napoleon, during the Napoleonic Wars, both Allied and French? So I'm going to be super boring on the Allied side and not pick any of the Russians and say Wellington was the best, probably. Yeah, I know you could make some honorable mentions for guys like Bagration or Kutuzov. But yeah, I think I'd still go with Wellington. Waterloo really was a masterpiece of a battle, and the whole Peninsula campaign was very successful. I think Wellington really was a great general. In terms of the marshals, far out, probably Davout. I know people give Ney a lot of shit, but I was actually a bit of a Ney fan. He had such balls that you have to give him a fair bit of credit. I don't know how many horses he had shot out from under him, but that fiery redhead Ney, probably, after Davout. But yeah, it's hard to pick. So Comrade Stalin asks, can I explain the meaning behind the gunpowder empires? I can't, to be honest with you. I don't know anything about that period in history, especially that period of history of the Islamic world. I can't, man. I'm sorry. I don't know anything about it. So Scratch80 asks, should the ADF increase the LHD fleet and incorporate the use of the F-35B? So, in a perfect world, yes. So, I think what, in theory, could happen, I'm not saying we should do this, given the real-world constraints of, money being a thing, but, imagine this in theory. So, the LHD is, the Canberra-class LHD is, it's a multi-role vessel. So, it is designed from its outset to be a multi-role, platform. So, it can act as a quasi-carrier. Not a full-blown carrier, but something... more like a rough forward operating base for the F-35B. Now, Australia's would need some modifications to do this. I've read, guys at the ASPI, they quoted about $500 million per ship. I'm not sure where they got that estimate from. If you look at the Japanese modifications to the Izumo to carry the F-35B, I don't think it was that expensive, and they're talking about much larger modifications. So, they might have an axe to grind there at ASPI against doing this. But, whatever. Let's just say it was $500 million. So if you could upgrade the two, Canberra and Adelaide to carry F-35Bs, and then have a third one, maybe to replace HMAS Chul's, and have a third, call it HMAS Melbourne. So now you have 3 LHDs. And if we had, for example, 28 F-35Bs that could maybe, be the final part of the F-35 purchase, the idea would be to configure these ships for different roles depending on what you needed at the time. So you could use them in full-blown LHD mode to conduct amphibious operations the way they've been designed for. There would be nothing stopping them from doing that. And maybe you could carry a small number of F-35Bs, or you'd have one of them configured in a carrier role to provide air cover for the amphibious operation. You could certainly do that. If you didn't need amphibious forces at the minute, what you did need was sea control. You can configure 2 of them, say, as carriers, and have between 8 and 12 F-35Bs deployed, and then Australia would be able to deploy small carrier battle groups to different places. If there were, if there was a humanitarian disaster, you can configure them for humanitarian relief and use them in that role. So I think this kind of flexibility that's inherent in the Canberra class LHD could be utilised to really increase Australia's air power from the sea if we wanted to do that. Now, is this realistic given all the other budgetary constraints Australia has and all the other systems that desperately need recapitalisation? Probably not. So obviously that would only happen in a perfect world. But I think that would be a smart way to use the platform to the greatest capability, to its greatest potential capability, I should say. So, you could use it as a carrier when you wanted, when you needed a carrier. To provide sea control, or maybe, to provide anti-submarine. You could use it as an anti-submarine warfare platform as well. So you deploy your Canberra class with, a task force of a Hobart class and a couple of the future Hunter class frigates with, say, 6 anti-submarine warfare helos and 8 F-35s for air defense, and all of a sudden you've got a pretty potent Hunter killer group. So you can use it for anti-submarine warfare, you could use it for full-blown amphibious warfare if you want to, you could use it as a full-blown carrier if really what you need is air defense. So yeah, I think that's certainly a possibility. I don't think it will happen, and I think given this wasn't the whole point of buying them in the first place. Australia wasn't trying to do this with these platforms. The whole reason we bought the Canberra class was for an amphibious capability. It was all because of Timor, but you could, in theory, utilise them in this way as true multi-role vessels. That would at least be possible. Okay, so Swiss Evans asks, can I remember the first bit of history that really captured you? Yeah, I was probably, God, I would have been maybe 6 or 7, and I watched a classic documentary on World War II called The World at War, and I watched it every week, and it became my favourite documentary. I think I was really young, and maybe grade 1, grade 2. I can't remember, but it was just, war is terrible, but it's the most epic drama that human beings go through, and understanding past wars has always been fascinating to me. How they work, what happens, why did one side win over another, what was it like for individual people. This is always endlessly fascinating to me, and some people see it as glorification. I think understanding conflict and war through our history is actually the best way to avoid its worst aspects, if we actually understand what happened. So that's probably it. In terms of ancient Rome, I was always fascinated with ancient Rome ever since my dad first talked about it when I was really young. How this one city conquered, the whole world. I was fascinated as how that happened, why that happened, what was so special about the Romans. But it really wasn't until I went to Rome when I was about 20 that I decided I was going to do ancient history. So, yeah, it was probably those two key moments for me. So, next question. Red Dead Griefers asks, what books would I recommend about learning about ancient Roman wars? There's a bunch of good ones, man. The ones I got into before I started, studying at a university level, a lot of this stuff was Adrian Goldsworthy's work. So Adrian Goldsworthy is a PhD historian, so he's a legit, full-blown academic historian, except he's decided to basically write popular works as opposed to academic works. So if you're interested in the Punic Wars, he's written a great set of books on the Punic Wars. It was how I learned about them, that were really awesome. He's also written a number of other books. One was it's In the Name of Rome, I believe, which was basically about different Roman generals, which is really interesting. It covers a whole swath of different Roman wars. It gives you a basic overview of the war, but more about the generals themselves. So, Caesar, Scipio Africanus, Sulla, all the way through to Belisarius. Really interesting book. Super easy to read. There's no Latin or Greek in there. There's no historiography or anything like that. So, I think his books are generally pretty good. I'm sure there's a heap of other ones out there that are a great place to start. But that's the first easy to read popular books that I read on ancient Rome, and I think they're still out there. So yeah, Adrian Goldsworthy. So user something. What are my thoughts on the Reddit users versus hedge funds on the stock market? I have no idea what you're talking about, man. No idea at all. I don't go on Reddit. So Tom Drummond asks, is current mechanized or motorized infantry more effective? This is an interesting question. So it depends on what you're trying to do. So mechanized infantry has more firepower. It generally has more mobility across lots of different kinds of terrain. So motorized infantry in general needs roads. Not totally, but just in general terms. Mechanized infantry, because it's all tracked, can go anywhere. It can go over mud, can go over pretty large obstacles. There's more firepower because there's more tanks. Infantry fighting vehicles are more heavily armored. That's what I should explain what a mechanized infantry is. So mechanized infantry is infantry that uses tracked fighting vehicles. So like a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle or a BMP, and has a lot of tanks. So tracked tanks. So mechanized infantry has it's more firepower. It's probably more capable. If you have just motorized versus mechanized infantry, you would expect the mechanized infantry to win if it was just a straight up fight. However, the problem with mechanized infantry is it's bloody heavy. All the components are ridiculously heavy, and this makes it, although it's mobile within the battlefield, moving it between theaters or moving it from one continent to another is very difficult because of how heavy it is. So this is why a lot of Western militaries are moving more towards kind of a hybrid model. Like, for example, the Striker brigades in the United States Army are a great example of this. So they've gone to kind of a medium model, which uses the Striker wheeled infantry fighting vehicle, which is much lighter than, like an Abrams tank. And what this means is they still have a lot of the benefits of a mechanized infantry. They have fighting vehicles that are right there to provide fire support, high levels of mobility. So you can this is almost like a medium brigade rather than a full-blown light infantry brigade. They have mobile gun systems as well. So what this is like the gun taken off an old Abrams tank and put on one of these Striker wheeled infantry fighting vehicles. So yeah, it gives them high levels of mobility around the battlefield, pretty decent cross-country mobility, but the whole thing's much lighter. So that means if you're in the US and you need to deploy a couple of brigades to a combat zone quickly in, say, the Middle East or South America or Asia or whatever, you can put heaps and heaps of Strikers on C-17s or C-130s and fly them there. So that's called strategic mobility, the ability to take your forces and move them from one country to another, or one continent to another, or one theater to another. And so medium or motorized infantry is better at that. It's more mobile strategically. It has less of a logistic footprint. So that's why a lot of countries, advanced Western militaries, are moving more towards motorized or medium forces and less on full-blown mechanized forces with tracked IFVs. If you know where you're going to fight, so if you're the Russian military, I think they'll still have a lot of mechanized forces. Heavy forces are heavy for a reason. They have heaps of armor. They have heaps of firepower. So they're just less mobile strategically, I think. So F-18 lover, which is the best 4th gen fighter? Oh, it depends. Are we counting 4.5 gen? I guess not. I guess you're saying 4th gen. So let's exclude Rafale, Typhoon, and Super Hornet. In terms of just a fighter, I think you can't go past the F-15, I think. I think in terms of a pure air-to-air fighter, the F-15 has been supreme. Its combat record has been amazing. And, how we've seen, Su-27s in combat, they are much less technologically advanced than, contemporary F-15s if you go inside the cockpit. The Su-27 is an amazing fighter. It's an amazing aircraft, I should say. Literally, it's just an aircraft. It's amazing. But, I think, the Russian aircraft really fell behind the West there for a while. So I'd have to give it to the F-15 if you're talking about pure air-to-air combat. If you want to talk about best overall strike fighter, I think you have to give it to the F-16. The Fighting Falcon is an amazing aircraft. It's amazing in a dogfight. Its energy maneuverability, its EM capability is amazing as well. Its kinematics, basically unparalleled. People kind of talk shit about the F-35 that it can't dogfight with an F-16. Well, lots of things can't dogfight with an F-16. An F-16 is an amazing dogfighter, probably the best of the 4th generation. If you get into a sustained turn fight with an F-16, if you're in a normal flanker, an F-16 will run rings around you. The F-16 is an amazing aircraft, and just how now cheap it is, and how versatile the F-16 is. An F-16 is a one-stop shop for a whole air force. You could build a whole air force just around that one platform. Excellent strike, good reconnaissance, suppression of enemy air defense, excellent fighter, good interceptor. The F-16 is an amazing fighter. Honorable mentions. I love the Tomcat. Tomcat's pretty amazing, and I do love the flanker family. So the Su-27 is has to be up there as well, I think. So that'd be my picks for 4th gen fighters. Now, if we wanted to talk about 4.5, you got Super Hornet versus Typhoon versus Rafale versus advanced flanker variants. That's an interesting discussion too. I think it depends on what role you're looking for. If you're looking for a strike platform, I think Super Hornet wins that pretty easily. If you're looking for an interceptor, maybe a Typhoon, although the advanced flanker variants are pretty impressive as well. The thing that lets the Typhoon down is its radar. It really doesn't have an AESA radar, even yet. They still haven't done that. And they were talking about doing that 10 years ago. So that does let it down. I think to really utilize the Meteor missile to its fullest extent, they really need to get that AESA rolling out to all of their operational Typhoons. It's a tough one. I mean, the Rafale gets an honorable mention. It's good at a lot of things. I think for strike, I'd probably go with Super Hornet. For air superiority, I might go with an advanced flanker, but it's hard to know what their real capabilities are because you can't trust a lot of the Russian stuff. That's for 4.5. So next question, Tom Bird 01. If New Zealand got a fighter, what plane would they get? So I think it would come down between two choices, the Jazz 39 Gripen and second-hand F-16s. I would probably pick second-hand F-16s personally. I think, as I just said in the last question, the F-16 is an amazing fighter, and the capability it provides for the cost is pretty much unparalleled in the 4th gen. I know it's getting a little dated now, but the Block 52 Plus is a very capable aircraft, and you can get them pretty cheap. I think they could have. From my memory, the United States offered New Zealand a deal on some Block 40 F-15s. Sorry, F-16s. F-15s. And they were dirt cheap. I think New Zealand's Labour government has just decided to disband the combat part of the New Zealand Air Force, which was a crime against humanity, I believe. So they would have done really well out of that. I think that would have been like 2024 or so. Pretty decent F-16 Block 40s that can be upgraded to Block 50, 52, which is a very capable fighter. I think other than that, buying a Gripen / Erie combination. So what you can buy with Gripen is their airborne, their AWACS aircraft, which is it's on a propeller airplane. It's quite small. It's got an advanced AESA radar. And basically, if you use the AWACS in combination with the Gripen, it really becomes a nasty little thing to contend with because although the Gripen has a very small radar, you can data link targeting information from the AWACS aircraft to the Gripen, which allows these small, hard-to-see jets to shoot Meteor missiles at you from very long range, which makes them quite a nasty thing to contend with. So, I'd say the Gripen in second place. Depending on what kind of deal you could get on F-16s from the US. So, RPM asks, what are my plans after graduation? I have no idea. I have zero plans, dude. I have zero plans. If I do want to go into full-blown academia, I'm probably going to have to move. And, I've bought a house here, and, I like where I live, and, the wife's happy here. I'm not sure I want to do that. I'm not sure I want to move states again. All my family's in this state. I'd go back to Sydney, but I don't want to go to Canberra or anything like that. So I'm not sure, to be honest. I'm not sure what I'm going to do. I'm a bit of a crossroads because, this will be finished soon and, I won't know what to do. But, I guess we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So can I do something on the Pax Britannica? I'm not sure the Pax Britannica is a real thing. I know it's talked about, but really, can we talk about an age of global peace? There was lots and lots of wars in the 19th century. There wasn't any global conflicts. So we didn't see a repeat of, say, the Napoleonic Wars, but there's still plenty of conflict in Europe and other places. So, again, this is not something I've thought about too much, but I actually think maybe it's a bit of a mix, a bit of a myth, the Pax Britannica. So, next question. Charlie Martin, thoughts on FDR? I think he was a great president. I think a lot of people are critical of the New Deal, but it did seem to work. I think this kind of Keynesian intervention in the economy, state intervention, has become a bit of a dirty word in the United States. It's become a dirty concept, but I think history says that there's something to that level of state intervention, especially when things are going as badly as they were. I think the New Deal was generally a good thing. In terms of World War II, I think the best thing FDR showed was he could see the kind of threat that Nazi Germany and right-wing extremism posed, not to just the democratic powers around the world, but also to the United States as well. There was a lot of people were there was an isolationist movement in the US, which I think was pretty short-sighted. And, FDR saw past that and, really saw that the United States did have to make a stand. And I think the reality was, with him as president, the United States was going to enter the war one way or the other. Basically, he was ratcheting up the pressure on both Japan and Germany to strike a blow. And Japan did. And Germany declared war. So I think that was going to happen one way or the other. Really, he had launched an undeclared war on Germany specifically in the Atlantic, well before December 7th. So, I really think that was probably his greatest moments were actually prior to World War II. Now, during World War II, again, he showed a pretty steady hand. I think he underestimated Stalin, though. I think he may have underestimated Stalin a little bit. Speaking of Stalin, Comrade Stalin, how do I see the Armenian and Azerbaijan war from the prospect of military? I guess you're looking at it from a military perspective. Look, I'm not sure, man. I think it really depends on how much foreign intervention there is, how involved the Turks get, how involved the Russians get. So, we'll see how it goes. Look, to be honest, weirdly, I haven't paid that much attention to that conflict. I probably should, because it should be right up my alley. But, it's just not something I've been looking at the minute. There's been a lot of other stuff going on. So, Real Free Abrams, got a bunch of questions here. What's the best theory, in your opinion, about the Bronze Age collapse and the origins of the Sea Peoples? I have zero idea, man. Weirdly, yeah. My expertise in ancient history basically stops at archaic Greece, so the period after this, and I've never even looked into it. So I've never even read anything about that. I know that's, a crappy answer, but it's the truth. I don't know anything about it. Next question. Did Australia consider the Rafale? Yeah, absolutely it did. So the Rafale was considered in the Joint Strike Fight, in the program to replace the F-18 Hornet. So I believe it was, I'm just going off memory, man, this was 20 years ago. This was literally around the year 2000. But Typhoon was looked at, Rafale was looked at, I believe F-15 was looked at, F-35 was looked at. I can't remember if there was anything else that made it to final selection. But yeah, none of them were found to be competitive with the F-35. So that's when I'm pretty sure Rafale was dropped. Dassault, I remember, opened a business. They opened an office here. A business. They opened an office here, and they were really pitching Rafale pretty hard. Interestingly, the Russians pitched the Su-30 as well. So this was back in the late 90s when the Russians decided, hey, maybe we should start trying to sell weapons to Western powers. I remember there was an air show here that year. I was still pretty young. And I went to the Avalon Air Show, and it was awesome. There were literally flankers, Russian flankers at Avalon that year. I believe there was Rafales as well, because everyone was pitching for this program. But I think the Russians offered $30 million per aircraft with manufacturing rights for Su-30 variants. Which was pretty crazy, but yeah, it's a very good deal if you think about it. But it was turned down in favor of the F-35. The F-35 is more capable than all of those platforms. And it took us almost 20 years to get the F-35 in this squadron service, but it is now. So why do Australians hate the Tiger? Because it's a dog of an aircraft. Because it's been an absolute pain in the ass. Now, there's nothing wrong with the Eurocopter Tiger itself as a platform. It offered a lot of nice advantages. It has very long range. Remember, how these attack helicopters are quote-unquote armed reconnaissance helicopters. So reconnaissance is a big part of what they're intended to do. Not just go out and smash tank columns in Iraq, like Apaches are used to, or have been used for in the past, sorry. So, Eurocopter has a great range, and it really, it looked really good on paper. The problem was we basically became an orphan owner, because we wanted different weapons to other people. We prefer, for example, the Hellfire missile. No one else was using that, and it just became a real pain in the ass. It was not a mature platform. There wasn't a large pool of users, and there really wasn't a large amount of support and sustainment from the outside of Australia, essentially. So they've been very expensive. They've been very maintenance intensive, again, because they're developmental, or they're not full on developmental, but not as mature as something like Apache. And they've been an absolute pain in the butt. I think I remember someone saying we had to literally print our own manuals. We had to make our own manuals because they weren't available. Just stuff like that. So yeah, it's been an absolute pain in the butt. So I'm very happy that we've just gone to a mature platform Apache that you'll just plug in and play. It'll just work from day one, and we'll have an effective capability. Yeah. So why did Australian pilots like the F-111 more than American pilots? I didn't know the Americans disliked the F-111. I didn't know that was a thing. I know that in general, I'm not talking about the pilots, but just in the Australian strategic community, the F-111 was much loved. So for a small to medium-sized air force like Australia to have that kind of strike capability that could fly that far and penetrate air defences that well really was a prestige thing for the ADF, for the RAAF, to have F-111s. And they were much loved by Australians for years and years and years. It really was something that was, special that not a lot of other air forces of our size and capability would have. So they were much loved in Australia. I think the reality is we should have replaced them basically when the United States did. I think by the 90s, they were getting way too long in the tooth. Their whole mode of operations, low-level ingress, really wasn't required anymore, and it wasn't as effective as it had been. So I really think we should have replaced them with F-15Es in the 90s. But in terms of the pilots, I'm not sure. Another one. What happened to the Jutes, and why weren't they remembered as well as the Angles of the Saxons? I have no idea, man. No idea. I have no idea, unfortunately. I don't know anything about the Jutes, dude. It's kind of outside of my area of expertise. How important was the Roman religion to everyday lives of Roman people? Very important. Ancient Rome was a very religious society. So, there are often episodes in large battles that seem ridiculous to us. So, for example, in the Battle of Aleppo, which was a battle between a predominantly Roman army, although they had its Spanish allies, and a Punic army, a Carthaginian army in Spain. And the Romans had won a great victory, and they were about to literally slaughter this huge Punic army. And a huge thunderstorm came through and just blanketed the battlefield in rain, which often happened in the afternoon in summer. But basically this sent all of the Roman soldiers scurrying back to their camp. And it wasn't just because they were scared of the rain. It was because all of them saw it as a very bad omen that the gods had intervened in the battle and they really should stop. This was really how religious all of them were. Gods were really viewed as part of public life, not just in this kind of religious way, but just basically there was something called the Pax Deorum, and what this was a peace with the gods. And so this was literally taken very seriously by Romans. So it was literally the job of the state to maintain good relationships with all of the gods. This was taken very seriously. So this is one of the reasons why Christians were persecuted, funnily enough, because they violated the Pax Deorum, because by running around saying all of your gods are not real, Roman officials were legitimately scared that they would anger Roman gods, or not just Roman gods, all of the other gods, and this would violate the Pax Deorum. So they took religion very seriously. Often we read funny little episodes about reading, portents and reading the entrails of certain animals before a battle, and this really stopping these huge events from happening and thinking, God, this must be crap. But I think it was real. These were highly religious people. So Mitch State asks, what's my favourite plane of World War II and what was the best plane? My favourite plane? Oh, probably the Spitfire, just because it's beautiful. In terms of fighters, the best one, the one that had the most impact was probably the Mustang, P-51D, just because the combination of, having basically the same performance as a Spitfire, very similar. They had the same power plant, and having massive range, like the ability to literally fly from London to Berlin with full fighter escort was a game changer. So I think probably in terms of fighters, that was probably the best one. In terms of bombers, maybe the Lancaster was the best bomber. It had a ridiculous payload, although the B-29 was probably more advanced in the end. What else do I love? I love a Focke-Wulf 190. It's just gorgeous aircraft. And I didn't like many of the Soviet designs. I thought they were a bit ugly. Yeah, Zero was ugly as well. I didn't like the Zero too much. But yeah, that's probably my favourites. So, Comrade Stalin again. How much do I think the oil thing was responsible for US invasions of the Middle East? I don't. I don't think oil was that important. So I think it was important because it makes the region strategically significant. It's kind of important at a foundational level. I really do not believe any of the kind of quasi-conspiracy theories that say that the whole reason the US started invading these places is literally because they wanted oil contracts or they wanted control of the oil supply. I don't believe the evidence shows that to be true at all. So for example, if you look at Iraq now, the US doesn't own its oil. It's the state-owned Iraqi oil company operates Iraq's oil fields. That hasn't massively affected the price of oil, so that hasn't really changed too much. Iraq's oil deposits alone weren't enough to do that, considering all the other OPEC countries. It wasn't going to break OPEC. All of these things don't really make any sense. Yeah, I don't buy into that at all, pretty much. I do buy into the idea that what the United States was trying to do in Iraq, especially in 2003, was dominate the Middle East by installing a friendly government in Iraq, which they hoped would basically foster regime change in other places like Syria. So I think that was their ultimate goal. Now, what makes the Middle East so important? Yeah, oil has a lot to do with that. So indirectly, oil was a driver of US policy, but not in the kind of direct way. I think people buy into this because it makes sense to people. It's nice and easy. Oh, they just wanted oil. That makes them money. Oil's worth money. I can understand that. Kind of trying to wrap your head around realist geopolitics is a little more difficult, but I think basically that's what it really was all about, trying to improve the US's position in the Middle East, and primarily by removing Saddam Hussein, which the neoconservatives were arguing for years and years and years. So yeah, I'm not a big buyer into the petrodollar or any of that crap. I don't believe it personally. So, Sherig asks, everyone compares politics today to the rise of fascism or the fall of the Roman Republic. What are some of the lesser known or useful historical analogies? You're testing me on the useful or the lesser known historical analogies there. The Roman Republic is such a big one. I suppose, there's lots in ancient Greece. So, the end of Athenian democracy is a good one. The rise. So I would say some interesting ones are things that happened in the Peloponnesian War is a good one. So I guess you could kind of compare Trump and Trumpism to a guy called Cleon. Any of you guys who played Assassin's Creed will have run into this dude. So Cleon was a real person. He was a tanner and he was a businessman, and he wasn't of the normal political stock of guys like Pericles. And he rose to prominence basically by criticizing the old order. Very much drain the swamp, lock her up kind of chance. And I'd actually see what happens with Trump and recent political events is a little quite similar to what happened there. It might not have necessarily been about the rise of fascism per se. So I don't think, there's a huge difference between, say, Trump and Hitler in terms of their ideology. Like Trump, I don't think has a full-blown racist ideology at all. I think he just wants to win and wants to maintain his own position and wants to maintain political power. It's not really about ideology for him. I think it's just about who supports him and how he can maintain his position. So, I don't know. Probably the best one I could offer you is Athens during the Peloponnesian War is some good analogies to what's been happening in the United States of late. So Matt Benjamin asks, how do I feel about the velocity of money theory being an argument against allowing billionaires to exist? I haven't even looked into what that is, dude. I'd have to go and just have a read and and figure out what you're talking about first. So sorry, dude. Daniels asks, really like to hear a historian's perspective on religion and its impact on warfare over time. Has it evolved or has it been constant? It's definitely evolved over in the modern period, has definitely evolved. So religion and warfare were constantly intertwined, going all the way back to the ancient world and before. If you look, for example, Celtiberian tribes in the 3rd century BC would have warrior priests that would not only fight, but would perform sacred acts prior to battle. Keeping the gods on side during war was foundational to their method of warfare. This goes through to the Romans had very similar rituals around the declaration of warfare that made sure that this war was just, and it appeared to be just to the gods. Religion was fundamental in basically diplomacy, but also in making sure that individual soldiers thought that God was on their side. I think as society of late has become less religious in general, the importance of religion to the military has kind of waned as well. We saw this in the 20th century. It was interesting though, like even I remember hearing, I'm not sure this is true, but I remember hearing this, that on every belt buckle that was given to a Wehrmacht soldier during World War II, it literally said, God is on our side. So, for a modern army like the Wehrmacht in World War II to have an overtly religious symbol on every part of their uniform is interesting. It definitely shows how important religion still was as a motivating factor in World War II. If you're going to get men to fight and potentially sacrifice their own lives, having religious blessing or the appearance of religious blessing for a war is very important. However, I think at the moment we're really seeing it start to drop off. Obviously, if you there's a whole huge chunk of history that I missed there. So if you look at the Middle Ages and moving through to like the Renaissance, religion was critical. It was more important than it ever has been in human history. Probably it was really the central organizing feature of Western European society. I'm talking about mainly Europe here. I don't know too much about China. Obviously that was super important then too. And you had the wars of religion, which not only drove massive violence, such as the 30 Years' War, although it's debatable how much the 30 Years' War was really down to religious difference or not. But religion has had it's been a huge driver of conflict historically. And it's been very important within militaries themselves to maintain that feeling of being on the right side with God. So, Federico asks, what do I think happens if Italy joined the Allies in World War II? It depends when, because they did join the Allies later on. I guess you're meaning from the outset. I don't think too much changes. I think basically the Battle of France still goes Germany's way. And the Italians just get crushed by the Germans, pretty much. Unless the Italians fully, launched an offensive into Austria. But even then, the terrain is just not conducive to a large-scale offensive. And the Italians were no match for the Germans whatsoever. So I think the reality is you would have seen in 1940, after a French campaign, you would have seen an Italian campaign. And, Rome would have fallen to the Germans very quickly. I don't know how much the British could have done to stop it, to be honest. There wouldn't have been any North African campaign, though. Basically, I think the Italians would have sailed their fleet over to Alexandria, and you would have had an Italian British fleet that was very dominant in the Mediterranean. So there would be no chance of any North African campaign. And other than that, the war probably would have gone on the way it did. Maybe you would have had a Anglo-American invasion of Sicily and eventually Italy, like we actually did have. But I don't think it changes all that much, to be honest with you. So James Spencer asks, how come everyday Germans followed Hitler, even though he was so evil in what he wanted to achieve? Well, I think the difference is firstly, he didn't ever gain a majority of popular support when he was just another politician. So the way the Weimar Republic worked, basically, he formed a coalition government with the Conservatives. I think the highest amount of the popular vote he got was about 38%, so which is still a lot. But I don't think it wasn't the overwhelming landslide you might think. Basically, he formed a coalition, with the Conservatives and the right-wingers against the Communists, and basically seized power once he was Chancellor. So, but even then, Why did 38 or 39% of people vote for him? Well, you have to remember that people didn't realize how evil he was or what his ultimate intentions were. The things he talked about were very popular in Germany. He talked about, ending the depression, putting people back to work, restoring Germany to her rightful place as a great power, reversing the evils of the Versailles Treaty, which most Germans were very supportive of. And even anti-Semitism was very widespread back then. It was much more normal to be racist in the 1920s or the 1930s. There were even kind of perverse scientific theories which justified it. Like social Darwinism and that kind of thing, like basically bastardizations of Darwinism and evolutionary biology, basically. That weren't real science, but people did think in these ways, that there was a hierarchy to the races, and that was a normal thing to think, and that's the reason why the empires existed and all this kind of stuff. So a lot of the things Hitler was saying, they weren't abhorrent to most Germans. They were kind of what a lot of them wanted to hear anyway. And he certainly wasn't talking about, doing a Holocaust in the early 1930s, not at all. And a lot of people were worried about the communists. A lot of, middle class, rural people were really worried about a communist takeover. And funnily enough, it wasn't the workers where, the Nazis got a lot of their political power base, which is what you would expect given their origins. I mean, it was originally a workers' party, but most of the people who voted for Hitler were actually middle-class rural people who were very worried about the communists. And, they did really want the restoration of German power. So they were the things that Hitler was selling to the German people. And, just because a politician says certain things doesn't mean they don't have ulterior motives. That's one thing we need to remember. So the history writer asks, if Rome and China went to war in the ancient world, who would have won? To be honest with you, dude, firstly, I don't know how they would fight that war given the huge distances involved. And secondly, although I can give you a very detailed answer on the Roman side, I don't know enough about ancient China and ancient Chinese strength to give you an honest evaluation of that, to be honest. I've barely even read much of ancient Chinese history, so I don't even know the dynasties or how large they were, or any of the military history really. So I can't give you a realistic answer. So I'm sorry about that one. Real Free Bams asks again, how did the different Germanic, Celtic, and Brythonic tribes govern themselves? Well, I can't tell you too much about the Germanic tribes. I haven't read a lot of the history on it. I know the information of internal governance, especially early in the piece, for the Germanic tribes is not great. The Celtic tribes, especially in Gaul, we know a fair bit about, especially from like the writings of Caesar and that kind of thing. And some historians have talked about the Celtic tribes in Gaul as kind of being like proto-Greek states. Like some of them would basically, they would vote in tribal councils and those kinds of things. Kind of not exactly a democracy, but something more close to a democracy than you might first think. So obviously there were, monarchies were a large thing in a lot of these tribes as well. But yeah, a lot of them had basically government by merit, which was interesting. So, office holders would be elected. Especially in Celtic tribes in Gaul. So, I haven't deeply looked into it. I only, tangentially know about it just because of Caesar and that kind of thing. But, a little bit more democratic than you might think. So, DJ Sinsclaw asks, what kind of media do I consume to stay informed? I mostly get my information through podcasts, to be honest with you, podcasts that I trust. And, I also search things on the internet. So, I don't really watch a lot of cable news. Sometimes I do just for fun, but mostly, what I'm getting is print media on just Google and stuff like that, and podcasts that I trust about different things. So like things podcasts by different think tanks, things like the Brookings Institution, stuff like that. There's a bunch of excellent like kind of strategy and also history podcasts I listen to. And also, some other stuff from large-scale print media. They do some good podcasts too. That's mainly where I get most of my stuff from. So, Real Free Abrams again. How exactly did Rome administrate their provinces? So, basically there was a difference between central Italy and the Roman provinces, obviously. In central Italy, as the Roman Empire was starting to build up, These were all basically treaty allies. So in Italy, none of the Italian allies had to pay tribute to Rome. They didn't have to pay any tax. What they did have to do, however, was provide fighting men or ships at the consul's demand. So it was a little different in Italy. But this really was the foundation of Roman strength, was this alliance structure. It really made Rome much stronger than she was by herself. Really, when you fought Rome, you fought all of Italy together under Roman leadership. And really that's what made the Romans so unstoppable. But outside in the provinces, basically they often inherited systems that were already there. So the first Roman province was Sicily, which they'd taken from the Carthaginians. So basically, the way the Carthaginians had run their province was each of the cities paid tax to the Carthaginians, and the Carthaginians kind of, ruled over the whole of the island. So the Romans took on a similar model. So in Sicily, basically every city would have to pay tax to Roman tax collectors. However, inside the level of the city itself, the level of the polis, local laws and local magistrates were still allowed to go on as they had been before. So within the Roman provinces, there was actually a lot of local autonomy. The Romans didn't really care too much about how you ran your city, how you run your local government, who was in charge. All of that was basically left, to the natives to run as they saw fit. Basically, at the very highest level, above the level of the city, the Romans basically appointed a provincial governor with a reasonably small number of administrators as well. So these were typically ex-consuls. They were either called pro-praetors or pro-consuls, which are basically extended versions of those two offices. And these provincial governors would usually spend, between a year or 5 years administering the province. And so basically these people would be like mini kings, essentially. They would be the ultimate person of appeal. So if there was a dispute between two cities within the province, or a dispute between two individuals that couldn't be resolved at the level of the city magistrate, which again was all local, they could appeal to the Roman provincial governor. Now, the provincials had a right of appeal to Rome itself, and basically many provincial governors, because it was only a small group of people that were actually in charge of administering this huge whole province. Depending if they had, some of them didn't even have provincial garrisons of troops. So literally just a governor and, as I said, a small number of administrators. So the opportunities for corruption were rife: bribery, extortion, all kinds of nasty stuff. So the provincials had the right of appeal to Rome itself, and many provincial governors were actually prosecuted after their term of office as a provincial governor, several successfully as well. But yeah, pretty much that was it. They'd just at the very highest levels, everyone was required to pay tax to the provincial government, but otherwise they were left to their own devices. And there was a reasonably meager administrative body under a provincial governor, which was a pro-praetor or pro-consul. So Souston asks, the modern world now has centi-billionaires. Based on history of non-state super rich, what happens to uber rich folks in the future, world owners? I don't know, man. I don't know. There's always been super rich people in the history of capitalism. The Rockefellers and who knows who else. So I don't know how much that necessarily changes. I think in general, rather than individual people, we do need to be worried about large-scale monopolies of multinational corporations. A lot of these corporations really do have more power than small states, and I think it's in all of our interest to be careful about these large-scale monopolies. But in terms of super rich people owning the world, I don't know. I don't see how much different it really is from super rich people 50 or 100 years ago. But I haven't looked into it that much. So Chandwerger asks, do I think how Western democracies judge socialist regimes is flawed due to bias and the backwards nature of the countries in which they take power? Look, I wouldn't say there's no bias in evaluations of socialist societies. There definitely is in some circles, but I wouldn't account... You can't simply account for huge amounts of academic criticism by bias. This is a really kind of sloppy way of countering an argument. You run into it all the time. I run into it on TikTok all the time. If someone doesn't like your argument, they'll often just say, oh, you're just biased. It's such an easy way of basically avoiding whatever it is you actually have to say. So, if you're, I don't think you can look at all of the academic analysis that's been done in the Western world that's been very critical of socialist societies and say, oh, that's all bias. I think that's basically crap. Not saying the biases don't exist again, but, academic work has to go through peer review process. And so if someone doesn't like what you've written, they'll tear it to shreds. So obvious bias is, there's a whole process designed to eliminate that kind of, obvious bias. So I wouldn't say the critique really comes from bias. If you're reading serious academic work, maybe if you're just reading a newspaper who's critical of a socialist society, sure, that could be something to do with it. But that's a pretty weak argument in my opinion. Now, does it have something to do with the backwards nature in the countries they take power? I wouldn't necessarily say that. So Russia was a little backwards when the Bolsheviks took over. But if you actually look at the first, say, 30 years of socialist government there, they did very well. The Soviet economic growth was very high and very well sustained. They industrialized very quickly. And I think a lot of Western analysts would say that was very effective. So I guess the fundamental point you might be making here is, have they failed because socialist regimes have not happened in a developed country? Look, it's a counterfactual and it's very hard to disprove. The reality is the historical examples we have of socialist/communist regimes have happened in less developed states. And developed states tend to be market-based economies. They tend to be free market capitalist economies to some degree or another. So, look, I don't know. It's just a counterfactual, so it's hard to know whether maybe it would be successful if it happened in Germany in 2021, communism. Who knows? My suspicion is it would not. But yeah, it's impossible to know. So, Real Free Abrams again. How did Macedonia go from being a backwater to the most powerful state in the Hellenic world? It all comes down to one man, I believe, Philip II. It all came down to him. So, basically, Macedonia was different because it was a kingdom and it was a little larger than a lot of the city-states. So, like Athens, Sparta was like this as well. Sparta had a bit of an empire in Laconia and Messenia, but a lot of the other states would run local leagues. So, Athens basically dominated Attica. Athens was weird because it was so large compared to its region, that its region was really its hinterland. Thebes dominated the Boeotian, so the Boeotian League. But it really was one city-state dominating a league of others who were, similar in heritage. Macedonia was different. It was this kind of larger kingdom that was a real backwater, of the Greek world. It certainly was part of the Greek world, but a larger kingdom than some of these city-states. It always had more kind of latent potential in terms of the land that it held and its population. The population was quite large compared to a lot of these city-states, but it was quite dysfunctional. It was really when Philip II really got his act together, essentially. I think they'd from memory, they'd won a small war in one of their borders that had opened up a couple of gold mines, and this had increased, or silver mines maybe. This had increased, Pella's wealth substantially, and this allowed Philip to really start working on the army, and it was nice that the Macedonians were doing well, but that doesn't mean they were any more dominant than the Thebans or the Athenians who were in alliance at the time. So it really came down to his military reforms, which again was just Philip. So basically, once he had developed the sarissa-armed pike phalanx, so the sarissa is an 18-foot-long two-handed pike, and basically he equipped all of his hoplites, which he actually made professionals rather than citizen soldiers. He was able to pay for professional soldiers who use these huge long pikes, which are actually very difficult to use in combat. You need to be very well trained to march as a block of men with these huge long pikes without everyone getting tangled up and all the rest of it. So it was really his military reforms that did it. And once they won at Charonia, that was it. That one battle basically instantly made Macedonia the dominant land power in in the Greek world. So yeah, it was pretty crazy. Now after that, yeah, it was just down to Alexander utilizing his father's army to defeat the Persians. Was why the whole Hellenistic period happened, really. So yeah, it all comes back to Philip, I believe. So, how were crimes investigated in Rome? Were there police? No, there were not police. So basically, the Romans had a court system that was all done in public and had something close to a trial by jury. So basically, what would happen is if there was a crime and you were, you feel like your neighbor had stolen your nice bit of pottery or whatever, you would basically go and confront your neighbor and say, "I think you've stolen this bit of pottery. I'm accusing you in court." And you'd both go down to one of the magistrates, I think the aediles, and say that a crime had been committed. This was a very formal process. And then the aedile would pick a lay person who was just another member of society in good standing to act as the judge. And so basically you would have this trial by, this one-person jury effectively. And, it would often be in public, and both people would have speakers on either side, and they would convince the judge. And so this person, who was a lay person, who was chosen by the magistrate as someone who would be impartial, would decide the case. So often there would be appeals if we're talking about, serious crimes that would get the involvement of the state, and you could have large-scale votes of the people to determine whether an appeal should go ahead or not. But that was basically how it would happen. You would have just these small courts, and people would get prominent lawyers and orators to speak on their behalf. Cicero really cut his teeth in the law courts by getting his great reputation for amazing oratory in defending people in these public hearings before a judge. So yeah, there was no official state police force or anything like that. Basically it was all up to the plaintiff to prove that the other person had done them wrong. Obviously all laws were enforced by the state though. So if say the judge awarded reparations, like that guy had to pay you, however much money, and they didn't do it, then it was totally legal to use force or to bring them before the court again. So the government could use force. So Comrade Stalin with the drone question. I've already hit that one, I think, man. I hit that one earlier about the drones in Azerbaijan. So Ryan asks, how am I able to retain all of my history knowledge? I'm currently doing an A-level history and would love to know how you remember everything. I don't know, man. There's no secret. I'm just a bit of a weirdo. I just remember all this history stuff. I love talking about it. I love thinking about it. And I've just consumed so much of it over my life, both academically and, just in my private time, that it's all just in there. But I've forgotten so much stuff. So I don't know. In university, I certainly didn't remember everything. I don't think uni, the whole way of lectures and reading stuff and doing exams or assignments isn't the perfect way of remembering things. I've forgotten so much interesting stuff that I learned, especially at my master's where we did actual coursework. Like I did early Christianity and all kinds of interesting stuff. I can't even remember half the subjects I took now. So yeah, it does just go. But I don't know. I think talking about it and writing about it helps. Certainly helps, keep your knowledge fresh, and keeps it sharp. So that's probably the only tip I can give you is, talk about it, write about it, think about it. But yeah, you won't remember everything. I certainly don't. Okay, Real Free Abrams again. How did Roman taxation work? I kind of got this on the last one with. So provincial taxation, basically cities who were not allies were required to pay tax that was set by agreement. And basically each one of those cities would pay the Roman governor tax, which would go to the Roman treasury. And in return, they would obviously get, they wouldn't have to have a military or anything like that. And their security would be guaranteed by the Roman administration. So typically in the provinces, the Romans did a lot of stuff by privates. So basically they would hire people to go and collect tax for them. And if they could do that in a way that was profitable to them, yeah, they would make money out of these tax contracts. So basically, they would sell the tax contracts to individual businessmen who would then go out into the provinces and collect tax in the name of the state. However, they would constantly extort people. And basically, people in the provinces absolutely hated these tax collectors. They became really loathed. And, the start of the Mithridatic War, basically a lot of these tax collectors were murdered brutally. So, a lot of it was outsourced, especially in the provinces. So Peaks says, the best history class I ever took was based on learning at the history of food. Have you studied history from an alternative perspective? Oh, I haven't, man. I've been laser focused on military history, to be honest. But yeah, there's some interesting things I remember hearing about the history of food. So, for example, an interesting theory I read, I can't remember if I read or heard about it on a podcast, was that the discovery of maize, of corn, was one of the main reasons why the Industrial Revolution happened and why the Renaissance happened in Europe, because of the additional calorific potential this gave to farmlands, which basically supported a much larger population. So this is one of the reasons we saw population explosion in Europe, in the Renaissance, which led to the Industrial Revolution and everything else, the Age of Exploration and massive colonization. And this was all because corn had come from the New World to Europe. Which is a really interesting thing that I wouldn't have thought of, that one species moving across the Atlantic could have such huge impact on huge historical trends. So that was something interesting. But I haven't really looked into a history of food or anything like that. So Lewis Smith asks, did the Battle of Cannae lead to military reforms within the late Republic to deal with the tactics of the Eastern empires? So yes, it absolutely did lead to some very substantial reforms, but these were not really utilized against the Eastern empires, funnily enough. So basically, Scipio Africanus was the direct result of Cannae. So Scipio was at Cannae. He was tribune of the Second Legion, and somehow he survived the battle. He was only young. I think he was only 19 or 20 at the time. And basically, he would go on to be Rome's greatest general of the Punic Wars. I would say one of the greatest generals Rome had ever produced. So at a very young age, his father was consul, and his father and uncle were basically conducting the war in Spain on Rome's behalf, because most of Carthage's power base was in Spain. And Scipio literally had seen Hannibal's battle he was at the Trebia as well, which was another battle where he witnessed how effective Hannibal's tactics were, and he was at Cannae. So basically, his father and brother were killed at the Battle of the Upper Baetis, tragically. And at the young age of, I think, 24, he put his hand up to be commander of the Roman army in Spain, which is a ridiculous thing at that age. He was extremely young. And when he gained full army command, he basically implemented a set of tactical reforms, utilizing something called the cohort, which was a different size of unit. Basically, it was like a middle-sized unit, like a battalion. And he implemented a set of tactical reforms built around maneuver, as opposed to the kind of attritional battles the Romans had used to fight. So typically the way the Romans would fight was they would line up against an enemy army with 3 lines of infantry, and they would rotate maniples. So maniples were small groups of 120 men, and basically they would grind down an enemy army by simply rotating men all the time, groups of men. And this constantly meant they had fresh men at the front of the battle face, because ancient battle was exhausting. You can imagine how tiring it would be to actually fight someone with spear and a sword and stuff. So this was the typical way of Roman operations, and it was very effective. But Hannibal had really solved it. Basically, Roman aggression in the center of the battle played right into Hannibal's hands. He would often use ambushes and flanking maneuvers to encircle Roman armies. So Scipio had seen this, and he basically formulated a solution to Hannibal's tactics, which were to use maneuver himself in a very different way to the way Hannibal did, but to not just grind down your enemy battle array in front of you, your enemy army, but to use maneuver to put them in bad positions, to flank them, do things like this. And he used the cohort in order to do it. So this was a total revolution in Roman tactics that happened basically because of Canada, and it basically happened because of Scipio. So the actual tactics Scipio used were different to Hannibal's, but they were similar in principle. So yeah, this was a huge change. However, really a lot of these weren't utilized in Rome's basically fight with the Eastern empires. The generals who were in charge of those battles tended to fight more traditionally. But funnily enough, when the cohort was really reintroduced in the 1st century, generals like Sulla, Caesar, and Marius would really utilize maneuver the way Scipio Africanus did, which was very interesting. So, definitely implemented that kind of level of tactical reform. Introducing a new unit called the cohort and moving to maneuver away from attrition. Alrighty, so RPM asks, I said I liked this idea of a separate Space Force branch. What sort of military equipment, vehicles, munitions do you see them having? So at the minute, most of what Space Force is probably going to be about is satellites, right? So it's all about satellites. It's all about finding enemy communications and reconnaissance satellites and doing something about them and protecting your own. So basically the first thing you need in Space Force is a set of sensors, radars, and telescopes essentially that identify what satellites are up there, who owns them, what do they do, where are they, what are their orbital periods. Secondly, devise ways to either counter them with things like lasers or blow them up with things like missiles. And thirdly, to devise ways of protecting your own satellites. So it really is all about defending the high ground, which is space. It'll all be, for the minute, in terms of munitions, just anti-satellite stuff like Standard Missile 3, that kind of thing. But a lot of it will be really about, figuring out what's up there and protecting your own space-based assets. Because look, everything runs on satellites now. If you can cripple an enemy satellite network, you really can cripple their military. So, that's what it's all about. So how important is the US military around the world? Well, currently the US military is the single underwriter of global peace and security, especially the US Navy. So the Royal Navy used to basically fulfill this role. So by having a huge dominant naval power that has global reach like this, the United States underwrites global trade. So basically, everyone can send their goods on the sea because they can be confident that they will get there, because there are no pirates in the world. There are no countries that go out and steal ships. There's no contested naval waters because the US Navy rules the oceans, just the way the British Navy used to rule the oceans for a century and a half prior to that. And this is the single biggest thing the US military provides globally. It underwrites global trade. Secondly, the US alliance network and the threat of US military power has provided a huge stabilizing influence in primarily East Asia and Europe. So we haven't seen a large-scale war in those places for a very long time, primarily because the US, the threat of the use of US force has deterred aggression in those places. So they're the two biggest, most important things the US military does around the world. I think the US's history in places like the Middle East is a lot more checkered, but it's a much more complicated place. If the US military just pulled back today, there would instantly be a power vacuum that I think Russia and most importantly China would take, and the world would look like a very different place. I don't think it's in the US's interest to do that. So with modern warfare, Marty Inns asks, in modern warfare involving AI and drones, my thoughts on 10 or 15 years from now. So basically, I still think you'll have humans in the system. So you won't have just drones fighting drones. AI would have to, I don't know if AI will ever fully replace humans. Just because of the legal and moral questions of the deciding to use lethal force against someone. And also just, we're going to want to have humans overseeing the actions of things like drones. You would have to have a full-blown general intelligence to be able to remove humans from the system. And we're not even sure if that's even possible. So the way I would see it happening is you will have aircraft or say submarines, which act as mother vessels or command centers. So basically, if you lose, I'll just use the Australian example because it's one I'm quite familiar with. Australia is now producing the Loyal Wingman combat drone, and so this is a drone that's relatively cheap. It's about $4 million compared to $100 million for an F-35. It has different nose sections, so it can be used for reconnaissance. I'm pretty sure it can be used for air-to-air combat, or will be able to be used. It can be used for strike missions as well. And the way this whole thing is designed to work is these drones are equipped with, pretty decent AI, which means you don't have to baby them. You don't have to constantly monitor them. You don't have to have a pilot, in a container somewhere flying them. You just tell them to go and do things and they'll go and do them. So the way this will be tactically employed is you'll have one F-35 or two F-35s flying together, controlling, say, 10 of these drones that are out much further away. Bringing in intelligence, maybe taking missile shots on enemy aircraft, maybe dropping bombs. And this keeps the humans at a further arm's distance from the actual combat. And it also makes, your F-35s worth 3 or 4 or 5, for every one by using much cheaper and more expendable Loyal Wingman drones. So I think you'll see, these little nodes with manned platforms controlling a number of drones going out and trying to penetrate the battle space and doing things like that. But the same for submarines. So you'll have a manned submarine and a bunch of unmanned submarines further out that are in connection with the actual mothership. And so combat between submarines will actually take place between the drones in the center to try and either destroy your enemy underwater drones or get a firing solution on the mothership. So it'll become combat will evolve into combat between these different networks of drones and manned platforms. So it'll look very different in, say, 10 or 20 years. So thoughts on the Allies' restrictions of Germany after World War II? I don't know, it was a little harsh, but I think after the colossal destruction of the Second World War, partitioning Germany was, maybe warranted. And if you look at the country that Germany is now, it certainly isn't the one it was in 1912 or 1938. So it worked. Germany today is a positive member of the global society, absolutely, and so is Japan. So I don't know, maybe they were too harsh, but maybe not. So what's my opinion on South China Sea lately? It's going to continue to be a serious flashpoint because of Chinese aggression there. Basically the Chinese claims there are ridiculous. They basically violate the sovereignty of several other nations, and they take a huge chunk of what is international waters and just arbitrarily make them Chinese. And considering the amount of trade that flows through the South China Sea, not just to China, but between other Southeast Asian countries and Japan and all kinds of places, that is basically unacceptable. But the Chinese will continue to push there because it's really something they want to dominate. So it certainly is a worry. Their construction of islands there has been a worry for about 10 years. And we're basically still seeing more of the same. So, I don't know. It's something I think, the liberal democracies need to stand up for things like free navigation of the seas and not give in to Chinese bullying, basically. So, Glizzy Bun asks, should Australia manufacture its own weapons and what would I manufacture? So, yeah, absolutely Australia should manufacture our own weapons as much as we feasibly can. So, anything that's large enough with a large enough production run to make it worthwhile, we absolutely should. So, I'm pretty sure... So, Australia is now buying a self-propelled artillery system. I believe we're looking at, I think it was the K-19, if I remember correctly, from South Korea. They're setting up a manufacturing line in Bendigo, I believe, to build them here. So I think all of Australia's land vehicles, as much as possible, we should try and build those here. Obviously, we build our small arms here. We build ships here. I don't know if we could justify an assembly line for F-35s. We just don't have enough. So for those kinds of things, probably not. But especially for as many large-scale army equipment as we can, anything with a large production run, we definitely should build in Australia, and we are. Things like the Bushmaster PMV is Australian built. I'm not sure what they're going to do with the Boxer reconnaissance vehicle, but I'd love for that to be built in Australia. Again, because we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of units. So I think one other thing we might need to look at is sophisticated munitions production. So Australia does produce much of its small arms munitions. So I think we produce all the way up to 155mm artillery shells. I don't know if we produce our own Mark series, like Mark 84 series of dumb bombs. We may very well. And all the way down to like 5.56 and 308. We make all that here. We may want to look into opening a production line for domestic missile production for air-to-air missiles and that kind of thing. Again, we don't usually have large enough stockpiles to justify it. It might be expensive, but it might be the kind of capability that we really would want to have onshore, just in case things got crazy. So maybe missiles as well. 420 Plugmeister. What are my thoughts on the Azerbaijan conflict, Armenian? Again, I haven't looked that much into it, man. I haven't had a good look at it, so I can't really give you any informed piece of analysis right now. I might do a story on it later. I might do a bit of research, and I might do a YouTube post on it later on once the dust settles and we know what's happened. But yeah, I can't really give you too much informed analysis right now. So, some random guy asks, is Downfall realistic in the way it represents Hitler's final days? Yeah, I think it is pretty realistic. I think the movie was based on the memoirs of Hitler's personal secretary. And so you often see these little moments in the movies where he's talking to her and how, like, the movie is really about her, like, early when she comes in and she's offered the job interview, and how charming Hitler is and how nice he is and how sweet he is to her. And these are all real things from her diary, and she was there throughout all the final days. So look, you can never trust one historical source completely. Maybe she didn't see things, or maybe she misrepresented things, but I think it's pretty close to that diary. I think it's pretty spot on, and that's why it's such a disturbing film. And maybe sometimes the acting was louder than it should have been or more, but I think it is a pretty historically accurate film for everything I know about it now. I think it's based on her memoirs, basically, and she was there. So Zach Mullen asks, what do I think Scott Morrison's legacy will be? I think he'll have positive and negative points. So I think people will remember the bushfires and how badly that was handled, at least politically. I don't think he handled that too well. But I think when everything is gone from the coronavirus, once we have the vaccine, domestically produced vaccine, start rolling out in the next couple of months, and Australia gets past this, I think a lot of our political leadership will be looked upon quite well for how we've handled the coronavirus. I know everyone absolutely decimated Daniel Andrews for the lockdown that Melbourne had to go through, and it was tough. I had to live through it. I didn't like it, but if you look beyond Australia's circumstance and look at the rest of the world, I think even Daniel Andrews will be congratulated on how well we handled COVID. So I think more than anything else, ScoMo will be remembered for COVID. Now, whether he fully deserves it or not, who knows? That's always the case with political leadership. But as we've seen in the Trump administration, simply following what the experts are telling you and implementing their advice was all ScoMo had to do, and he did do that. He absolutely did. So I think he deserves at least a good amount of praise for COVID. I mean, we're not out of the woods yet, but it's looking pretty good. Kester says, I've been watching you for a while, don't agree with everything I say, just wanted to let you know I really like your page and the way you handle situations. No worries, Kester, we never have to agree, man, especially on politics and stuff. There's a whole issue in our society now where if you disagree with someone, you have to dislike them, or if they're on if they have a different political view than you, then they have to be the enemy, and that's just crazy. It's toxic, it's one of the biggest problems in our societies at the moment. So thank you, man. Of course we can disagree. I'm not saying that all my political judgments are absolutely right or anything like that. They're just my takes and how I feel. So we should absolutely be able to disagree. So Jeremy asks, what was the Polish military like throughout the Second World War? Well, the Polish military was actually huge prior to the start of the war. The Polish campaign was a friggin' big deal. The Germans were fully committed in Poland. And I think the Polish military in general gets undersold because a lot of this comes down to essentially German propaganda during the war. So, there are these ideas of Polish cavalry charging tanks. And this is basically nonsense. Like the Poles had, heaps of anti-tank guns. They had large-scale infantry. Really, when you're talking about cavalry, it wasn't cavalry like lancers. It was mobile infantry. So, like lots of armies used this in World War One. It was actually quite effective. The Australian Light Horse was a famous one in my country. Basically, what this was infantry on horseback, and so they weren't, they wouldn't charge with like lancers. They would just use the horses to move more quickly than you could march, dismount, and fight. So yeah, a lot of the stuff in our view of the Polish military in World War II is based on this. It's tainted by this propagandistic view of these foolish Poles who really stood no chance against the Germans. The reality is the Poles fought valiantly, and they had a very large army. They were just up against the Wehrmacht, who really had become, especially in the early part of the war, the most capable land army in the world. So, I think they get undersold a fair bit. They put up a gigantic fight. It was a huge war, but they were always doomed by Soviet intervention anyway. There was no way they could have ever held off both. So that was it, really. After that, the Polish resistance was extremely heroic all the way through the war. And we should never forget the sacrifices they made. So, hypothetical question. What if America said fuck it and tried to take over the world? What would it look like? They can have two major allies like World War II. Depends. So if you say two major allies and go what? Japan and the UK? I don't know. So look, most of Africa is pretty dysfunctional. Not going to put up a fight. The reality is, Chinese... I think it'd probably be better to say what would the United States, Japan, and the UK look like versus a Sino-Russian alliance. God, it'd be tough to say. It really comes down to whether they can whether the United States can maintain naval hegemony. They probably can at the moment. Long term, though, like if that's a long war between the US and basically everyone, India, China, everyone else, it probably goes bad for the US eventually. They probably just get ground down by resources. I mean, the United States has the most powerful military right now, but I don't think you could strike knockout blows on everyone unless it used nuclear weapons, but then it would, face nuclear retaliation. So the US would probably lose that war eventually. They'd probably get ground down by just superior resources in the end. So, can I explain the relationship between the Senate and consul throughout the time of the Roman Empire? Sure. So, the consul was elected by the people, not by the Senate. So, the consul, there were two consuls. These were effectively the supreme magistrates of the Roman Republic. They were like the presidents, except there were two of them, which meant that no single person could hold ultimate power in Rome, which was, an important part of their constitution. So, basically, the Senate was a body. In a weird way, it was almost like a representative body, because to get in the Senate, you had to be elected to the offices of praetor or consul. I think some of the aediles as well. So these were, the highest ranking administrative positions or military positions in the Roman Republic. If you held that for your year, you would then go to become you'd get a permanent seat in the Senate. And, eventually there was an office called the censor who would go through, this is where we get the word census from, and they would audit the Senate, and some people would be removed, others would be added, blah, blah, blah. But basically, typically you would get into the Senate after holding your office of consul. So basically the Senate didn't have any formal ability to make laws or any formal control over the consuls. The consuls were... basically the ultimate authorities for their year in office. However, the Roman constitution was really governed by custom. Basically, the Roman constitution itself was called the Mos Maiorum, which meant the customs of our ancestors. And these held huge sway over everyone in Rome. Basically, the whole culture of Rome was dominated by this idea, this conservative idea that we must follow the customs that have come before us. And so this is very much the case in terms of the relationship between the Senate and the consuls. So basically, if you're a consul only for 1 year, and then you would be admitted to the Senate. So these were going to be your future peers. All of this council of elders, you were going to join this council of elders. And this represented the embodied experience and leadership of the Roman Republic. It really was like a brain trust, and the consuls would always defer to the Senate. Now, that doesn't mean the Senate actually had legitimate power over the consuls, but so, for example, if there were a delegation from another country, they wouldn't just go and speak to the consuls like you would to the US president. They would go before the Senate because of the immense prestige the Senate had, and the Senate would deliberate. And then basically, just by custom, when the Senate came to a conclusion, the consuls would heed that conclusion and go about and do what was deemed the best course of action by the Senate itself. So basically, in a de facto way, the consuls were less than the Senate. They would do what the Senate said. But this was only by custom and norm. But custom and norm are very important, and they were huge in Rome. That you only had 1 year in office. So if you were going to disregard what the Senate said, the rest of your political career, you would be shunned by this body who you were supposed to be, a part of. And this would be very damaging to your reputation. So it was very unlikely that a consul would just disregard the Senate's, advice. It was really, the Senate was an advisory body to the supreme magistrates, is the best way to think about it. But in reality, they held a lot of power. Okay, so last couple of questions. Do I think it's important that modern generals have experience as a standard service member? Or are they missing out on non-athletic talent? Not necessarily. Large-scale management at the very highest levels of a military doesn't have all that much to do with being a rifleman. I think it's a good thing that, it's probably a good thing that a general does come up through the ranks like that, but I don't necessarily think that it's necessary. I don't think that learning small unit tactics and learning, self-discipline, how to march, and, how to become a good rifleman, a good marksman, really have too much to do with administering a massive organization like a large-scale army. I think most generals would have come in through officer training anyway, so they would have gone through basic no matter what. But I don't necessarily. I think it's totally fine for someone to end up being a high-ranking general who's just held staff positions. It all depends on whether they're qualified at the time or not whether they've actually spent a lot of time in the field as a grunt. Being in the infantry. There's not many other jobs in the army apart from just being in the infantry. So. Lethmitch says, I'd like to hear more about the capabilities and aircraft of the RAAF. I might break this out into its own little, its own video. I can give you a little rundown now. So, basically, the RAAF is right now in its combat. So there's several wings in the RAAF. So there's like the combat air group, there's the airlift air group, and I think it's called support or whatever. And there's also intelligence as well. So, basically, for the combat air group, right now we're transitioning from the F-18 Hornet, which was a great aircraft for us, we've had for years and years and years, and we're introducing the F-35. So currently there is one squadron of F-35s that is rated for deployment, so it's ready to go. There will be another 2 squadrons, so there'll be 3 combat squadrons of F-35s, which should be all ready for combat by 2024. Now there's another as part of the air combat ring, there are 2 other combat squadrons. One is made up of F-18Fs. So we have 24 F-18Fs. Super Hornets. These are Block 2 Super Hornets. So they're the most advanced version of the Super Hornet. That makes up another combat squadron. And then so that was one combat squadron. There's another one which is made up of Growlers, which are electronic attack aircraft. So we currently have 12 Growlers in infantry. These are actually a huge force multiplier and one of the most important basic aircraft that the RAAF has purchased of late. So basically, a Growler is an electronic attack aircraft. It's basically designed to disrupt radars, disrupt communications, these kinds of things. And it's a huge force multiplier for a country like Australia. It's very important. Having a capability like that is very important for countering things like the S-300 surface-to-air missile system. So that's a huge part of it as well. that's the combat air group. So the best way to think of it is 3 squadrons of F-35s by 2024, all F-35As, 1 squadron of Super Hornets, F-18Fs, and 1 squadron of Growlers. This is our primary air combat capability. So roughly 100 fighters, give or take. So if you look at our support aircraft, so currently we have, I believe, 7 or 8 C-17 Globemasters, which are heavy lift strategic transports that can lift a hell of a lot of cargo and put it all the way across the world. So this actually allows Australia actually has like basically a low level, at a small scale, a global reach. So I remember during the early stages of the Syrian war, everyone got very excited because the Russians deployed about a combat squadron and a few thousand troops, a couple of hundred, I think about 1,000 kilometers from their borders into Syria. And everyone was saying, wow, this is a huge leap in the Russian army's ability to deploy its forces. I think it was the same year, the RAAF moved basically half a squadron plus AWACS and refueling tankers plus all of their support crews from Australia to the United Arab Emirates. We did it by ourselves straight away, no fuss, no issues, and deployed and started bombing targets in Iraq, and it was done without any fanfare. And that's literally the other side of the world. So the RAAF has the ability to deploy those kind of assets that far, which is rare for an air force of our size. And a lot of this comes back to things like strategic mobility, and so that's all supported by the C-17 fleet. So Australia has a bunch of C-17s. They also have a squadron of about 12 C-130Js, I believe, Hercules, which is kind of a medium transport, and another squadron of C-27 Spartan light transports. So for a country of Australia's size, we actually have a pretty large airlift capability. We have an ability to sustain forces very far from Australia simply by aircraft. So other parts of Australia's RWS capability are the AWACS aircraft. So we have E-7 Wedgetail AWACS aircraft. These are very advanced. They use a kind of radar called an AESA, which the US Navy is only just deploying now with the E-2D. There are a couple of other countries who have bought this aircraft as well. They're based on a 737 airliner, and they have a very large and capable radar. So we have 6 of those. We have a bunch of aerial refueling tankers. The Airbus, I think they're A330. I think they're the A330 multi-role tanker transports. So I believe we had 6, but we've ordered 2 more. I haven't looked up Wiki or anything for this, so I can't remember. But it's between 6 and 8 of these multi-role tanker transports, or maybe it's another one's being purchased and it's 9. One of them is used for VIP transport. So we have quite a large tanking fleet, which gives our fighters quite a long range as well. So Australia is big on these kind of force multipliers like tankers and AWACS aircraft. We actually have 3 dedicated electronic surveillance aircraft based on the Gulfstream Learjets. Now these are very classified basically, but what they are is electronic intelligence assets. So they're small, they're just in a Gulfstream jet, but they basically the whole idea is to analyze electronic communications and radar signatures and that kind of thing. So we have a dedicated fleet of electronic intelligence aircraft as well. If you look to the naval sphere, I think at the moment we're looking at 12. I'll have to double check I should have actually looked up the numbers, but from memory it's 12 with an option for a couple more of the P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft. And I think at the moment we're looking at 7 Triton long-range maritime patrol UAVs. So yeah, that kind of rounds out the RAAF, unless I'm forgetting anything. Plus, a bunch of trainers and that kind of thing. So Australia's the number of Australian combat squadrons is small, but I think the RAAF is more capable than those numbers would have you believe, given the quality of the platforms the RAAF has, and B, the amount of enabling assets they have as well. Things like tankers, AWACS, electronic surveillance, electronic warfare. So it's in these force multipliers that makes the RAAF more capable than it looks on paper. So anyway, I might do a like a modern history of the ADF on a YouTube post later on. That sounds like fun. So I'll include the development of the RAAF as well. Alrighty, so I think that was like 85 questions. Yeah, so it's gone for a couple of hours. Yeah, it's been really fun. Hopefully, I've answered most of you guys' questions. I know I've not answered a few there. But yeah, my knowledge is not infinite. So thanks a lot for all your questions, and I'll see you guys on TikTok.